So, welcome everyone. We're really happy to have you here. We have a very high attendance. My name is Anna Biederman. I'm a senior consultant here at SEDEX, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Thank you all for joining. We're excited to share with you some of the developments of legislation, and we'll have an interesting session today. To introduce a little bit about our speakers, Charlotte Kincaid. She's also a senior consultant here at SEDEX. She specializes in corporate sustainability, particularly in reporting and in the fashion industry. At SEDEX, she has worked with multinational organizations across food and beverage, fashion and textiles, and batteries to build responsible sourcing programs and help businesses to get ready for legislative requirements. Happy to have you here, Charlotte. And we also have Audrey Cleveland. She's head of global sustainability impact and engagement here at SEDEX. She has over a decade of experience working in sustainability, mostly within the consumer goods industry. She has played a pivotal role in developing complex sustainability programs for global giants like Amazon and L'Oreal. Her contributions have been instrumental in shaping policies that address ESG compliance and sustainability into business reality. So we're very happy to have her here and joining us for this webinar. For all the ones who joined us before, we will try to do this in the time together. We'll get an overview of the key updates for international legislation from around the globe, and we're gonna break it into key sort of areas that our audience tends to be from. This particular edition will have a deep dive in these legislations that is the EU CSDDD, the Canadian Modern Slavery Act, and extended producer responsibility laws across the US and Europe. We are also going to share some commonalities in what we're learning from these legislation updates and trends. And finally, we're going to wrap up with some examples of how SEDEX is working to support these businesses for compliance and also to addressing the challenges that these new legislations are bringing upon. And a little bit of housekeeping before we give it a go. The chat function in this webinar is not enabled, so you're not able to type in comments as we go. However, you are able to ask questions using the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. So please bear with us while we work on this presentation, and we'll try to address as much of the questions possible by the end of this session. There will be a recording and a slide deck available for you at the end of the session, and for all of those who are here today and all of the ones that you have registered. On the attachments as well, you can find that slide and some additional information on how SEDEX can support you. So feel free to use these resources as your own. A little bit about SEDEX for the ones who are not familiar with the company. SEDEX is a global membership organization dedicated to driving improvements in sustainable and responsible businesses across global supply chains. It provides data-driven insights through accessible tools and professional services, engaging with companies and our community of members of over 85,000 organizations across the world to continuously improve their ESG outcomes. We particularly focus on supply chain sustainability and worker rights within that supply chain. Additionally, we provide data and services to support people on their full sustainability journey, regardless of their current stage. So yeah, we basically work with companies throughout their whole journey. A little bit more information about us. As I mentioned, we have over 85,000 members, which means that if your business is not currently a member, you're probably working with one of our members. And as of 2023, we have over more than 100 1,000 active sites, which means that in your supply chain network, it is highly likely that you have a SEDEX member, that we have a SEDEX member working with us. Something that is also very interesting to know, and just to give a little bit of more context on who we are globally, 1 in 10 Fortune 500 companies are our customers, and we work with them in their sustainability goals. This helps us gather valuable insights and share them with others, which is what we're doing here today. We have conducted over 55,000 meta audits and over 300,000 audits in our platform. So yeah, we have a lot of information going on that will hopefully help you. And finally, introducing a little bit of SEDEX consulting. As I mentioned previously, both Charlotte and I are part of this team, which you may not be familiar with, but SEDEX Consulting has been around for over 3 years now, and we're dedicated to supporting the organization around the world and improving their sustainability outcomes, managing their risk and challenges, and achieving their goals. Our team combines data from SEDEX and a wide range of other global sources to provide insights for managing risk and achieving goals. We also bring business expertise, practical experience, and subject matter knowledge so that you can have the right solutions and a very bespoke services to tackle your sustainability issues. We currently work with many of our members worldwide, and as well with several non-members. So we basically work with a lot of various businesses, with a key focus on supporting organizations with legislation, understanding it, its implications, and how to approach it in a way that fits the businesses, the business, and also ensures compliance. We are here to share our insights, discuss what we learned, and recommend strategies for organizations moving forward. So with those introductions, I would like to pass it on to Audrey to get ahead with the content today. Audrey, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this great introduction. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here today with you to talk about favorite topic, anything that relates to ESG regulation. We are going to take you through today actually 3 focus regulation that we have found have raised a lot of interest among the community here at SEDEX. As a lot of you might know, this is an increasing platform. There are almost 3,000 regulations worldwide that relate to ESG. So while we can't cover them all today, we're really going to try to do a mini deep dive into a few of them. I'm going to start with a slight disclaimer that at SEDEX, we are always at the latest of the trend and really careful about making the interpretation of those regulations. As well, we also encourage our member and anyone that is listening here today to make their own research and make sure that if they're not sure, there are resources here available, like, for example, our consultancy team here at SEDEX. Okay, so today, what we want to cover are 3 main regulations. The first one being DPR, and that's actually both for the US and for Europe. And Charlotte's gonna cover that in a few minutes. I'm gonna start with CSDDD, which have recently emerged in Europe, in the European landscape. And then I will be moving on to the Canada Supply Chain Act that actually has been entered into force this year. So those are the 3 regulations that we're going to cover today. There will be plenty of room for questions at the end of the webinar. So we will do our best to provide as much content and guidance as we can today. So starting with CSDDD, so the European Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that has recently came into, that's been acted on the 24th of April 2024 this year, so only a few months back. And the good news with that new directive is that it's going to be implemented increasingly. So the scope is going to start in 2027, we expect. And then that's going to increase through the year. And I'm going to take you into more detail about this in a sec. That regulation has been adopted by the European Commission, and now is going to, for the next 3 years, going to be developed by each country member, meaning that we have top line information as of today, but each country is going to make sense of their own regulation at country level, and penalty is a fact of that. The directive is going to start by being applied. The first companies in scope are the one with a revenue of 1.5 billion. And so that's going to be from 2027, we expect, with reporting requirements starting in 2028. Moving on into the following year, this scope going to increase again, and so on. Penalties, so that means what happens if a company, a business does not comply. The risk could be up to 5% of the turnover. But again, that's going to be decided at country level. So you will have to watch the space according to where the business you're working for is operating. So that gives you a bit more information about this increasing scope. That means that we are in 2024, until 2027, companies should prepare. 2027, the reporting is going to kick off for company with 1.5 billion turnover. Then 2028, this scope is reducing to company at 900 million, and then 2029, that's all in scope company, and I think that scope reach company with a turnover of 450 million. Then there is also other scope that come into play, such as the number of employees and so on. What is the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive about? It's really much, as it states, a due diligence requirement. So if you are very familiar with, for example, CSRD, or even the SEC that is in discussion in the US, those are really much reporting requirements. What we are talking about today with the CSDDD is really much a due diligence requirement, meaning that companies are expected to do a deep dive assessment of their supply chain and take according action to make sure they remediate. That affects the entire supply chain. All of the upstream suppliers are in scope of this due diligence, meaning that if you haven't already as a business starting making relationship with your supplier, that's something that we encourage you to do. Downstream suppliers, so suppliers such as transportation, storage, and so on, are partially in scope of that regulation. So that scope is really depending on like what type of supplier you have in your supply chain. What is expected of business is really much to have the right set of due diligence policy and processes within a business to make sure that they are able to map and assess the risk in the supply chain, and those risks should be evaluated both across the environmental and human rights aspects. So if we look at the tool we provide at CEDEX, there is, for example, one tool that is called Radar that helps to map out worldwide where are going to be climate change impact, where are going to be biodiversity risk, where is the highest risk of, for example, child labor. And so that's what companies are expected to do, is really much a risk assessment of their supply chain. Then they would have to prevent and mitigate the risk. That means, well, really much looking at how are we going to implement a program within our supply chain to make sure that those potential risks are not emerging, and if they are, what are we going to do to mitigate them? Then they're going to have to monitor and adapt. So once the program has been launched, once they've started to mitigate those risks, companies are expected to assess how the program is performing and make sure that they adapt it accordingly. So if, for example, a company has set out a carbon reduction program on a specific part of their supply chain and that is not performing well, they would have to be able to demonstrate that they have taken the necessary measure to make this program more positive, with a positive impact. Again, for those who are familiar with CSRD, climate transition plan is something that you would have heard before. That's going to be something that is expected of company to integrate into the CSDDD. A climate transition plan is really much a program that explains to the public how a company is going to align with the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement and how they're going to become net zero by 2050. A CTP should include science-based target. It should also include any decarbonization measure that a company is taking. Any financial planning, so how is a company going to become carbon neutral? How they're going to achieve the net zero? What steps they're going to take? And that should be incremental in every 5 years. So let's say your plan starts in 2020, in 2030 until 2050. You need to explain every 5 years what KPI you're going to have to achieve your target. And finally, and probably most importantly, that need to be signed off at exec level. So most likely a CEO need to put a stamp on that CTP. Finally, something that is emerging in new regulation is the importance of having a complaint procedure and a remediation program policy in place. That means that for any person, any individual that has been impacted in a given supply chain with, for example, forced labor, a company shall explain what measure has been taken to support the victim and what financial or assistance has been provided to make sure that welfare is being looking after, that safety is being taken seriously, but also that the financial dimension is taken care of. That's something that's really much crossover with a lot of the regulation. We're going to see that in the Canadian Supply Chain Act. We're seeing that in the Modern Slavery Act in the UK as well. So this is something that if you already comply with some of those regulations, you would have already put in place into your company, into your business. Finally, the public reporting. That's something that is expected now with most regulation. Companies are expected to report on CSDDD on a public platform, which is called the ESAP. I think that stands for the European Single Access Platform. That's a new digital platform that will centralize any sustainability, ESG related requirement as well as financial disclosure for company, and supposedly make it easy for company to insert and share information. Yeah, so just to recap on CSDDD, I know it's a lot of information and actually that's such a complex regulation in itself. What we will suggest if we had to take 3 steps to actually get ready, like in the next 3 years, That's really much to look at what policy do you already have in place that could be used in terms of due diligence, and make sure you centralize those processes and streamline them. Then engage with your stakeholders. So surely you will have to start engaging with your supplier, like direct and indirect supplier. So for example, if you already have a very good relationship with your tier 1 supplier, you might want to start engaging and increasing that scope to tier 2 and tier 3. But not only your supply chain stakeholder dimension, we will also encourage to start building a network of external stakeholders, so like NGO, local partner that can support you with, for example, remediation program. And finally, locate your risk. So make sure that depending on like where you operate, where is your supply chain, where are your retail operation, that you have mapped out any environmental or human risk against your operation, so that you are already aware and you can start adapting backward the policy in according to what risk you're running. So that's it on CSDDD. Actually, there is so much more to say, but again, we're going to open up to questions. I'm going to now move on to the Canadian Supply Chain Act. That regulation came as probably an alignment with what we've seen in the UK, which is the Modern Slavery Act, also the Californian Transparency Act in the US. So if you're already aligning with those regulations, you will be quite familiar with the requirement here. That regulation actually already is in force, so it's been approved last year in 2023. And now, from the 1st of January 2024, companies are expected to publish a report. The scope is really much depending on your revenue and your number of employees, how much assets you have in Canada. But basically, in a nutshell, is $40 million revenue have to operate and sell goods in Canada, so import or export goods, and have at least 250 employees. So that's the headline. Again, that go into much more detail, so I would really encourage you to make sure that you see if your company is in scope or not. The Canadian Supply Chain Act require businesses to publish an annual report. That report shouldn't exceed 100 pages long, so it has to be quite condensed to some extent. Something quite important to have in that report, it's this idea of assurance. That's something that we've seen already in some of the other regulation. So if, for example, we're looking at the SEC in the US, assurance is a big part of that. What does that mean is that company, when they publish a report, they have to seek for a local recognized authority to actually come and put a stamp on the report to make sure that they have analyzed the content and made some kind of due diligence on it to make sure that the information that are disclosed are accurate. The report should include a risk mapping, so a map of potential risk focusing on forced and child labor. The company should also disclose any policy and due diligence process that are being pushed in that sense to protect any potential forced and child labor in a given supply chain. Any remediation program is also very important. So that's something we've just seen CSDDD, and that's something that recur here as well, is like what remediation program is in place for victims of forced and or child labor in a supply chain that have been fined. And finally, how do companies ensure that child labor or forced labor is not being used? So what action is taking place to make sure that there is an elimination of forced labor in a supply chain? The potential fine is up to 250 Canadian dollar. Again, that's really depend on what has been impacted, and I'm guessing we will see in the future what does that look like when a company do not comply. I think that's it for me for today. I'm now going to hand over to Charlotte, who's going to talk through the EPR. Happy to take on any question at the end. Thanks so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Audrey. So yes, I'll be speaking you through EPR today, or Extended Producer Responsibility, for those that are less familiar with this kind of legislation. So in summary, EPR legislation and policies, they're essentially a waste and pollution policy that encourages companies to design more sustainable and recyclable products and manufacturing processes. And these policies are built on what we call the polluter pays principle, meaning that the producers of the product are responsible for the management of a product at the end of its life. So that might mean that a producer is responsible for the recycling or reuse of a product back into the system, or the disposal of that product into landfill. And you might already be dealing with these types of legislation already. For example, in the EU, there's EPR legislation also in countries in Asia, such as Japan and South Korea, and some Canadian provinces as well. So internationally, this trend for EPR legislation has really been growing. So there's many more out there as well. Typically, the kinds of products that are covered in EPR legislation is packaging, and that's probably the one that you might be most familiar with. But also things like e-waste, batteries, and now also increasingly textiles. So looking at the EU in particular, and you might already be familiar with the EU waste framework and the packaging directive, so the packaging directive has obliged all EU member states to implement an extended producer responsibility system by the end of this year. Most already have one in place, and this means that now member states have their own legislation with regards to EPR laws that have very specific requirements for producers and also some consequences of non-compliance as well. Generally, all the rules in the nation states in the EU follow the principles of the EU directive, but they have their nuances as well. So, for example, in some states, there are exceptions for like smaller businesses that don't reach particular revenue thresholds, or for businesses that only import a small amount of, for example, packaging into an EU member state. There's also nuances around the obligations on producers and businesses, and that might also include the types of fees that they have to pay. They might have different obligations in terms of what they have to report on and to whom. And fees can vary state to state as well. Typically, businesses are required to join what we call a producer responsibility organisation. And in that organisation then takes on the administrative and management of packaging management at the end of life. And you pay a joining fee. You'll also then be required to pay a fee based on the amount of packaging, for example, that you're placing on that particular market as well. So, for example, plastic packaging often costs more per kilogram than packaging that's made from recycled cardboard, because of the environmental impact that those materials have is quite different. What's challenging about EPR legislation is for businesses understanding if they are in scope of the law. So the law is usually referred to producers, but producers might mean the manufacturers, it might mean the brand, or it might mean the distributor who is actually doing the importing of the product into the member state. So it can be quite challenging and confusing. Another challenge with EPR legislation, particularly in the EU, is that guidance around EPR and legislation is sometimes written only in the native language. So it can be quite challenging for businesses who are importing into those states to understand if they are in scope or not. And the EU waste framework is expanding as well. It will expand to also include the end of life of textiles. So this isn't in place yet, but the idea is that it will follow the same model in the EU as what exists for packaging, with clothing and textiles producers bearing the costs and responsibility for the operational side of recycling, reusing, and disposing of textiles. There are schemes already in place in some nation states, such as France, also the Netherlands and Latvia. Recently agreed by the European Parliament was that whenever this directive is agreed and enacted, businesses will only have 18 months essentially to then comply. So it will, once it's enacted, there will be quite a short period for member states and businesses to get everything into place. So it's definitely one to watch out for, though we don't know the dates yet for when it will be enacted. So something to keep an eye out for. Also, EPR has been increasing globally, particularly in the United States most recently in the last couple of years, really. So a lot of states in the last couple of years have introduced bills into their legislators in their respective states. So, for example, New York State, Washington, Rhode Island, just to name a few. Also, there are states which these bills have now been enacted and brought into law. So in California, Colorado, Oregon, Maine, amongst others, they now have EPR legislations which are live and asking businesses who import packaging into those states to comply. So again, it's something to keep an eye out for if you are importing packaged goods and packaging into US states. So now, just to kind of recap and bring together everything that Audrey and I have been discussing with regards to legislation. So what are we really learning from these updates? What are the trends? We've seen a real evolution from transparency legislation, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act and also the Canadian Modern Slavery and Child Labour Supply Chain Act, in which businesses are required to report on what they're doing, what the risks are. That has evolved to then mandatory due diligence, as Audrey did the deep dive on the EU CSDDD, which is requiring businesses to have due diligence processes and policies, grievance mechanisms in place. This is also another example of this is the German Supply Chain Act as well. So legislation is asking more of businesses than we've seen more recently. Legislation is also, we would say, becoming a bit more prescriptive, and I think this is helpful for businesses in that businesses now have hopefully a clearer understanding about what the legislation is asking from them. This is particularly evident, I think, in the Canadian Supply Chain Act, where it describes what businesses have to include in their statement Whereas in the UK Modern Slavery Act, it was a series of suggestions about what should be in their statement. So legislation is becoming more prescriptive over time. We also think that legislation has started to look more at the entire value chain and the impact of the value chain from the beginning, from sourcing to manufacturing, and then now to the end of life, and what happens after that post-consumer. And that's most clearly seen in the example of extended producer responsibility that we just talked through. And then the last trend, which I think is really interesting, is that legislation is now looking at both the environmental and social impacts, not just one or the other. And I think that's really important because it's often seen that environment and social impacts are tackled separately, but in reality, these two things are really interconnected, and therefore having a piece of legislation that encourages a more interconnected approach, I think, can reap more benefits environmentally and socially as well. So just to talk through how we're supporting businesses with legislation here at ZX Consulting, I just wanted to talk through an example of one of our solutions, which is called a legislation diagnostic. So a lot of the time, businesses who might be members or non-members of ZX come to us because they see that there is a plethora of different legislation coming through related to supply chain. It can all be quite confusing. And we really work with our clients to help them to understand this really complex and very quickly evolving regulatory landscape. So our legislation diagnostic solution, we help businesses to understand and get ready for legislation. So this begins by identifying which pieces of legislation they're in scope of now or will be in soon, based on where they might source from or the markets they sell into and where they operate. We also conduct a gap assessment, so looking at the current policies and processes that business has in place and comparing that against the requirements of legislation that they're in scope of, identifying what the gaps are, and then helping them to plug those gaps by building roadmaps and action plans to address these gaps. And then we also work on the implementation side, meaning we help them to identify those gaps by if they need to create a new policy or a new process, such as the responsible sourcing process, we would do that with them as well. And our legislation diagnostics can be global or regional or at a national level. They're typically on supply chain due diligence, looking at the human rights and environmental side of supply chains. But we can also focus on specific topics or sectors. So, for example, on EPR and packaging legislation. And I just wanted to run you all through just a quick case study to hopefully bring this all to light. So we worked this year with an electronics manufacturer, and we did a legislation diagnostic with them and also developed a responsible sourcing program. So they came to us as they were aware that there are a lot of EU legislations coming in that require supply chain due diligence, and they weren't sure what they were in scope of. They were also aware that they sold to quite big multinational companies that might also be in scope of these legislations as well. They were also aware that being in electronics, they might be in scope of conflict minerals and battery materials laws in the EU. There are EU laws on these materials that require supply chain due diligence, and they wanted to know whether they're in scope and what they needed to do. They were also unsure of the kind of supply chain risks, and at the time they had a lack of supply chain due diligence processes and responsible sourcing policies. So we came in and we performed a legislation diagnostic to help them to understand legislative demands. We also conducted a risk assessment of their indirect and direct suppliers using our risk assessment tool called Radar. And this looked at risk in terms of environmental and social risk. Based on the findings of our legislation diagnostic, we updated their internal policies, such as their supplier code of conduct, conflict minerals policy, and created a battery materials policy as well. We also supported them to comply with the Canadian and UK Modern Slavery Acts, as they were in scope of both. And we developed a responsible sourcing process with them for the first time, and a rollout plan for that, and governance model as well. And the outcome of this was that they now had a compliant modern slavery statement. They also had an action plan to achieve responsible sourcing goals, set targets, and monitor effectiveness against KPIs. And they had a standard operating procedure for supplier due diligence for their buyers to follow. And lastly, they had a full understanding of their supply chain risks. So that's everything from me. I would love to hand over to Anna now. He's going to take us through the last slides. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte and Audrey. Thank you for helping us translate this very challenging knowledge into more digestible information. As we've seen, there are some patterns and some learnings that these legislations are evolving from transparency to mandatory due diligence, looking at the full extent of the value chain. We're learning that, and as Audrey mentioned, with the EU CSDDD, there's a lot to do about that. And just to recap a little bit of her suggestions as well is to regroup the existing due diligence policies and processes that you already have, to map out your entire value chain with direct and indirect partners, and to locate any environmental and human risks. I know this sounds like a lot, but this is a very good opportunity to start working on it as well. And thank you, Charlotte, also to giving us an overview of all the EPR legislations that I might guess that may be new information for a lot of the audience today. It extends beyond packaging, beyond electronics, and increasingly it's growing also in textiles. So there's much to learn about EPR, and good to know that since in the EU member states will have like a small deadline to comply, that is 18 months. So it's good to be aware and ahead of this. So I know this may sound like a lot. There is a lot of work to be done, but also a lot of opportunities to work and improve due diligence practices. So the key here is to be proactive. And as we've seen in the polls, there's a lot of interest in the EU CSDDD because it's one of the most complex pieces of legislation coming up. And amongst the challenges that you have answered are the actually understanding what the legislation is. So hopefully these webinars are going to help you with it, and also monitoring and reporting compliance. And no worry, you're not alone in this. So before diving into the questions and to wrap up the content today, I want to share about a little bit more information on how we can help and how to partner with SEDEX to actually meet your sustainability priorities. And of course, amongst that is legislation that is the topic of today. And for those of you who aren't familiar, one of the key areas that SEDEX actually supports with is visibility, and having in terms of your own sustainability goals and managing your supply chain. And within the membership, you're able to look down your entire your entire supply chain as long as you're working, connect with your supply network, and then assess and act on various sustainability metrics such as business ethics, labor rights, health and safety, and environmental factors. With all this data in mind, you can understand what's happening in your supply chain and your own operations. A phrase that I like to use is, what is not measured, it is like it doesn't exist. So having this visibility is really helpful and especially useful for this upcoming legislation. And this will allow you to make more insightful decisions about the best way to move forward. And this includes determining what you need to do to comply with these certain laws, achieve your goals, and share necessary information with customers, investors, and other stakeholders for their benefit. And as Audrey and Charlotte have highlighted, there is a significant increase in demands for information. And this is also from the investment community through ESG reporting and other mechanisms. So having a robust data at hand is essential for that reporting and for meeting some of the other regulations that we discussed today. This is certainly one of the areas that SEDEX can support you with. And finally, the compliance element is crucial, and the SEDEX membership can help you gather this data and working within your supply chain. Well, the consulting side of the business can help you that the actions help you know how the actions that you take will help you achieve these compliances and integrate into your business's processes and making them part of your approach rather than an additional task. With all of these in mind, let's give it the floor to you and actually answer some of the questions that you have for us. So one of the first questions that we received is this one is for Audrey and is how can we use Meta and other SEDEX tools to meet legal requirements?
Thanks, Anna. That's a very good question, and SEDEX has been created initially to ensure due diligence in supply chain were positively impacted. So we are working every day to make sure that we align with those regulations as much as we can to support our member. I would say that with the three main tools that we have, which are as Radar, ASAQ, and SMETA audit methodology, that give our member or that give a SEDEX community a really good kickstart with aligning with those regulations. So you could imagine, for example, using Radar to do a risk assessment of the supply chain, then driving an ASAQ questionnaire to start the communication and engage that communication into your supply chain. And then the SMETA will then come into place to make sure that you have visibility of issue in the supply chain, but that you also have potential guidance on how to address those issues. So it's not going to be a one-off stop, but that's definitely a very good holistic package that can support a due diligence program for a company. I would say that beyond that, we will also encourage companies to drive collaboration beyond their supply chain to open up discussion with key stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Audrey. For another question, this is for Charlotte. What are the implications when your tier 1 suppliers protect the identity of their tier 2 suppliers, and for the reason that this information is commercially confidential?
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, that's a really difficult question. It's a difficult challenge. We do work with clients that this does happen. I think a big part of it is around, this is a very new topic for a lot of suppliers, and it's about education, having conversations and building trust between you and the suppliers. So really, if you have good relationships with them already, sitting down with them and taking time to explain what you need from them exactly, being a bit pragmatic, make sure you aren't asking for information which is actually not required. Be really specific and explain why, and that will be really helpful, and then helping them to come on board and actually give you the information that you need. But also, I think it's important for suppliers to know as well that they might have other customers coming soon asking them for the same information. We see that this legislation is coming, so like the EU CSDDD is coming. So we're kind of turning the corner here, and I think suppliers will have to increasingly be more collaborative in this sense. And you might want to think as well about, are there any particular incentives you could apply to encourage suppliers and their suppliers to provide these bits of information. And yeah, I hope that answers the question. But yeah, it's definitely a difficult one.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte, for that. We have another one for Audrey. What is the geographic scope of these new regulations, such as CSDDD, only within the EU or also beyond the EU? And did the EU provide a template to fill in or to comply with this new regulation?
Thanks. Okay, so the CSDDD is a European directive, but as many of the regulation, the scope and who is in scope apply way beyond that. So non-European company are also going to be in scope of that directive. So that include both European company and non-European company. I believe that the scope for non-European company are the one that generate a revenue of 450 million for the last 2 financial years. And I think there is something around the number of employees for those as well that relate. So it's definitely, even if it's a European regulation, that's not only for European company, and that extends way beyond that. I think altogether there is a total of 5,000 company in scope to date and to get started. So that just to give you a rough idea of like who's going to have to comply with that. The second part of the question was really much around has the EU provided a template to fill and match that regulation? The short answer to that question is no, as of today. There is the text proposition of law. Now, for the next 3 years, they're going to work out how that's going to be implemented for each country. And as we've seen with CSRD, they are going to create probably that type of template to make sure it's uniform and easy for company to align from one country to another.
Thank you, Audrey. We're receiving also questions around if we're gonna share this presentation, the slides, and yeah, we're gonna share both. And you can feel free to reach out to the resource to the attachments section that you'll find on the bottom of the screen. So yeah, you'll have the slides as an attachment as well. One of the questions that we also had is if it's possible to have a demo of our digital solutions. Within one of these attachments, it's also a way to contact us, so please feel free to do that. And then we have a question also for Charlotte here. In the Canada Act, actions taken to remediate requirement different from the compliant procedure and remediation procedure. One is actions taken versus policies to address. Is this correct?
Yes. So one is, if I'm understanding the question correctly, one is what actions are you taking to remediate any instances of child labour or forced labour that have occurred. The other one is a requirement around having a grievance process, a grievance mechanism in place so that people in your supply chains or in your workforce know where they can report instances of this, and ensuring that that policy is robust and transparent as well. I hope that clarifies it. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. And then I have another question for you. We are in the UK. Why do EU and US laws apply to me or affect me?
Yeah, I can answer this one. And I think we've talked about this a bit today already. So Audrey said that, for example, the EU CSDDD will have an impact on non-EU companies. Non-EU companies will be in scope, but also you might have customers that are in scope of these laws, and the requirements might trickle down to you. They might ask you for more information about your processes, how you manufacture things, for example. Also, because of this, if you can't provide this kind of assurance and information to your customers, they might end up going elsewhere. So it is really important to be in the front foot of this and understand if your customers will be impacted and how you can prepare for that as well. And similarly with EPR, companies who are like importing into EU, for example, you might not be based in the EU, but you're importing there, so you may have to comply with EPR legislation as well. So yeah, it could definitely impact you out if you're not in the US or EU.
Perfect. Thank you for that. One of the other questions that we also had is if businesses can do a joint statement to fulfill requirements of the Canadian and the UK Modern Slavery Acts.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yes, that is possible. We know some businesses are doing that, and we worked with a client to do this as well. So it is a way to try and reduce, I suppose, workloads and streamline processes. You might want to think about looking at the Canadian law, seeing what's strictly required to report on, and potentially you could use that as your template for your report, and then review those requirements against the UK Modern Slavery Act and make sure those requirements are also brought into your statement. So would say as well, just to make it very clear that the statement covers both the UK Modern Slavery Act and the Canadian one. And of course, the report will need to be submitted to the relevant authorities in the UK and in Canada as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you so much, Charlotte. This has been really a very insightful session. Thank you so much for all of the audience for attending. It's really good to know that there is so much interest in these topics. It means that we're going in the right direction. For more information, please visit our website, where you can find a range of articles, blog posts, and details about upcoming events. We have more webinars coming in, so hopefully you'll find them helpful. Feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much for your participation today, and we'll hopefully see you in future webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.